All right. Last week we created a little React project to make a club homepage. We created an image carousel within it, and we showed you how a React application actually works and sort of how it runs. And so today our goal is to create this sort of upcoming events page. And we'll get back to the image carousel and homepage that we made last time once we combine all of these pages into a real site. But today we're just going to focus on this upcoming events page. And so this is our end goal by the end of today. We want something that looks like this. And our real goal today is to show you what a backend is to show you where we can fill or populate data onto our site from another source. And you'll notice once you start to create a more complicated site, you might not want the information on your site to be the same for everyone. Maybe they'll log into an account and suddenly you want the text to say hello to the person who's logging in. So maybe if I log in, it says hello Josh, but if Ryan logs in, it would maybe say hello Ryan instead. And so this is sort of where you would start to use a backend in order to change the data that's on your site based off of information that you have. And so today it'll be handling some pretty simple data, but eventually your backend could handle some important data that will change based off of these different variables. And so today we'll introduce you to a JSON-based backend called Koa, K-O-A, and this is really just another library that we can use in order to create a backend for our site, just in the same way that we use React as a library to create a front end for our site. And you'll start to notice that all these different libraries that we can combine together and use very easily, use other developers' code, is the real reason that we're using Node.js and therefore actually JavaScript to create websites, is because we can easily reuse other people's work into our own site to add it all together and get a finished product like this. And so today we'll start by actually creating a little backend project. And so the best way for us to do that is to find some folder somewhere that we want to create it, and we'll actually initialize it by first I'll make a folder and I'll call it Club 0, and then I'll go into this folder, and within that we want to say, hey, I want to create some sort of npm project. And so we haven't actually done this before. Last time we used this neat little program that would create a React application for us, but we don't really have those training wheels when we're dealing with a backend. And so to create a project for this library, we're going to simply run the command npm init to initialize. And it'll ask you for a bunch of things, and we're just going to hit enter for all of them to give the default values. And by the end of this, you'll see that it'll create a file that is called package.json, and that's how you know that it works. It's really just putting all the information that we wrote into this file. From there, we have to actually install Koa, which is the sort of backend library that we're going to use. And to do that, just in a similar way that we sort of npm installed React at one point, we're going to use npm install and just type Koa, K-O-A. And once we press enter, it'll be added to our project. And you'll see that in our package.json, it'll add it as a dependency, something that our project needs. And it'll add all of the relevant files into this node modules folder that generally you don't need to worry about. From here, we need to actually create a file to sort of run our project. Just like how our React application started with an index.js file that then loaded in our app component, we're going to do something pretty similar here, in which we're going to create an index.js file to start working out of. And this is where we're going to define our backend application, right? Our backend application, instead of returning a bunch of HTML and CSS, we instead want to return some information or some text to the user. And so we'll give you a very basic example here that's just going to return back hello world, and that's all it's going to say. But notice that you'll be able to change this in order to return back anything that you want. And so to actually start with this, we have to import Koa in some way, just like how we had to import React. And the way that you do this on the back end is by actually creating a constant for it. And so we'll just say, hey, I want to create a constant, and I want to call it Koa just so we can keep track of it. And it's going to require the Koa library. And this is sort of how we import things on our backend application. Next, we're going to actually create an application. So we want another constant, and we're going to say, hey, I want to create an application. And what type of application? Well, we want it to be a new Koa application. And if you think back to maybe Python or Java, whichever programming language you've done before, what we're really doing here is creating a new Koa object. But if that doesn't make any sense, just think that for now, we're creating a new backend application here. From here, we can say, hey, whenever our app is started, we want it to use some function. And so we can use app.use, and then we can define a function to put in here. And of course, you can define this function in any way you want, right? You could define it up here by using the function keyword and saying, hey, what parameters do we need? giving it a name first. So I'll say hi, and then what parameters you need. And it turns out that whenever you are creating a new function for sort of your backend, it's always going to have some sort of context, for lack of a better word. And this is just the current information that your backend is going to send back to the user. And so in this case, I'll say, hey, our inputs are context. And for now, all that we're going to do is set the body of the context to something. And so the body is really just the response back that we're sending. It turns out that when we send something back to the user, there's a bunch of different things that we can change, like the header and what type of request it is. But in reality today, we're just going to change the text. In this case, we'll use context.body in order to do so. He already came in, bud. It's fine. He already came in. We're going to use we're going to use body or context.body in order to change that text. And today, we're just going to set it to hello world. And now we'll go back to our app.use and we'll tell it what function we want to give it. And in this case, we just want to use the hi function, so we'll put that in our parentheses. And then the final thing that we have to do is we have to tell our program, hey, we want you to actually run. And so it turns out that a backend is sort of like this little server that attaches itself to, I guess, a port, for lack of a better word, in your computer. And so what we're really doing is we're just saying, hey, we want to listen, and we'll give this just a random number. And in this case, I'll use 3001. And this won't make a lot of sense yet, but in a second, once I run this application, it will make a lot more sense. And so if we save our file here, we have a very basic backend created, and all it's going to do is return hello world. And this may look a bit cryptic, but if we actually head into our file, and if we then say, hey, node index.js, node, of course, is going to run this file using node.js, and index.js is the name of the file. If we hit enter, it turns out that, hey, it's going to yell at me, and that's because I think the address is already in use. And that's because I left open that demo program, which used the same sort of number here. And so if I change this to maybe 1234, hopefully I will alleviate that error. And if we do node index.js again, nothing's printed out. And it turns out that that's actually a good sign, because we didn't tell our program to print anything out. And so everything's OK. If I head over to my web browser, if I remember here from my program, my number was 1234. So if I head over to localhost, and instead of using 3000, which is what a React application uses by default, if I instead type in 1234, we'll see that I'm met with the text of hello world. And it turns out that that's exactly what I set the body of my sort of response to be. And if I change this, of course, it will update. If I change this to hi and refresh the page, we should see after a second that it will update. But it turns out it doesn't, and that's because we didn't stop our program and turn it back on. It turns out that our backend application is created completely from scratch. It doesn't have any of the training wheels that our React application does that allows it to automatically sort of stop and restart the program whenever we make a change. And so that's something that you'll want to keep in mind as you continue to develop. You may run into this issue where you think you implemented something and it's not showing up, but it might be because you didn't stop your sort of backend from running and turn it back on. And if we head back over now, it'll say hi, which is our updated text. From here, this might not seem very useful, right? We're just returning static text, and that's what we wanted to avoid by creating a backend, right? We want this to be dynamic in some way and return something a bit better. And so it turns out that we can define what's called this is really just called a GET request, right? Because we're getting information back from the server. And so it turns out that we can define our GET request to return basically anything we want. If we, for example, had maybe some JSON that we wanted to return, or maybe even an image, right? We could return anything using this. And so if we head over to sort of the next example, if we head over to Club 1, which is really just a pre-made, Club 2, which is really just a little pre-made version of this. And it turns out we've defined this events.json file. And this is really just an array with a bunch of objects within it, each of those objects being what's called a dictionary in Python, which just has key and value pairs, right? So ID is a key, and 0 is its pair. So if I grab all of this JSON here, I could edit my sort of simple project here in order to return that JSON instead. And we'll get a little bit closer to the final product that we're looking for. If I instead maybe defined a variable up here, and maybe I call it events, because we want to return all of our events, and if I set that equal to all of this JSON, it may get a bit messy, but if I then save, we have this events variable. And if I, instead of returning this back, this hi string, if I instead return back events whenever we call our API, if I save it, once again, if I refresh, nothing's going to happen. But if I restart my program here, we should see that once I refresh my API, I get back a bunch of JSON containing all of the events. And so it turns out that we might not always want to return the events, right? Maybe we want different parts of our API to handle different things, and it turns out that we can actually make that change as well. We can say, hey, I want certain parts of my site. Maybe I want /events to return all of the events instead of just the home page, right? Maybe you have an API that's going to handle events, but it's also going to handle a shop, and it's also going to handle a calendar. And so you want a way to separate these out. Right now, if I go to my API, it always returns the events. And so it turns out we are in some way going to have to define routes, for lack of a better word, or different parts of our site that correlate to different sets of data. And so the way that we can do that is if we head back over to our file, we first are going to have to import something new. And so we'll say, hey, I want to define a router, right? We want the user to be able to go to different parts on our site and get different information. And so in this case, I'll say, hey, I want to require this router, which is at @koa-router. And in this case, we're actually instantly going to make it into an object, for lack of a better word. And so we're going to add the parentheses right behind it. And so this is the exact equivalent to doing this that we did before, except now we're just going to do it in one line. And it looks a bit confusing, but you'll probably see this if you read some backend code online, and so that's why we're showing it to you. The next thing that we're going to do is, hey, let's just try to run our application. And you'll notice that it's probably going to yell at us. It doesn't in this case because we haven't used router yet, but we have to actually install our Koa router as well, just like how we had to install Koa. And the way that we can do that is we can run npm install once again. If we run npm install, and then I think it's at @koa-router, we should see that it will install our Koa router for us. And so we'll be all good to work on our application from here. Right now, we just have this function hi being called all the time whenever we use our application, but we want to change that. And so instead, we're going to say, hey, app, I want you to define some sort of, we're going to take our router, apologies, and we're going to say, hey, I want you to define what's called a GET request, right? And I said a few minutes ago that a GET request just means that we're giving some data back from our server, right? We're just giving them information. And so we'll say, hey, router.get to define what type of request we want. And then we want to say, hey, at what URL do they get this information? And so because we're returning events, we're going to give it /events. And that's where they go in order to get all of the event information. Then, just like when we used our previous example, which I think used app.use, we have to define some function to be called whenever you go to this URL. And so in this case, we'll use an arrow function, which we've used before, which just says, hey, look, I want to take in the context of the current event, and then I want to do something with it. And so in this case, we're once again just going to set the body of the context, in this case, to events. And so this is very similar to what we wrote previously. But if we now run our application using node index.js, we'll see if we head over to our site and refresh, we get not found. And that's because we didn't say what gets returned when we just go to the base of the website, right? I haven't gone to /events. If we now go to /events, we should see that our website updates, and it gives us all of the JSON information. Unfortunately, it doesn't, and that's probably because I may have ran the wrong file. Interesting. So far we've set it to, hey, we just wanted to listen on 1, 2, 3, 4 using our app application. And it turns out we haven't actually told it where all of our routes are. And we have to tell our backend in some way that, hey, /events actually means something to us. And so right now, our application is just looking for that app.use statement that we had before. And because it's not there, it's always going to return us back, not found. And so it turns out if we change this and stop using app.listen, we'll also have to add an app.use for all of our routes. And so if we now say, hey, router.routes, and put sort of routes after parentheses, it turns out that router.routes is a function, and it returns back all of the routes that we have. And so instead of using app.use in our own function, we can say, hey, I want you to use all of the routes. And if we save our file now, and hopefully if we run this again, we should get the response that we're looking for when we go to /events. Now if we head back over just to the main part of the website, it turns out we get not found, and that's because we didn't define a route just with /. If I quickly define one and I say, hey, router.get, and I use /, and then I define a function in here called maybe context, once again I use my arrow, and if I set the context.body to maybe be hello, if I now just go to the main part of the site, I should see hello. And once again, I didn't, and that's because I didn't stop my application and turn it back on. And so now if I do that, we get hello. And so you can see now how we can set different parts of our API to return different things depending on where the user goes or what parts of it that we actually call. And so we have a little bit of a more nuanced example within Club 2 here of this happening. And so it turns out instead of directly hard coding our events within our file, we can grab them from a file somewhere. And that will allow us to edit those events later if we so chose. And so this is an example where we grab everything from this events.json file and return it back to the user. And so if we head over to index.js, we'll see, hey, look, we require a new library. And this is the FS library, which just means file system. And it lets us sort of manage, edit, read files that are on our system. Then we define a new app, and it's once again a co-application, and that's all good. And then we define a variable called events, and we're going to hold all of our events within that. Then probably the most cryptic part of this is this function called getEvents. And so we're just going to rewrite it quickly so it makes hopefully a little bit more sense. And all that we're doing is we're saying, hey, I want to grab my file system, and I want to read some information from it. So I'm going to call the readFileSync function, which if you think back to Python, this is just kind of like a read if you're sort of reading in some information from a file. Then I have to say, hey, what file am I actually reading information from? Well, in this case, it's events.json is the file that I want. And from here, we can continue to do even more things, right? We can say, hey, I want to sort all of this information, do all that jazz. But this is the main thing that we actually did here, is we just read in the information. Next, we could say, hey, I've just read in raw text here. We have to tell our program that, hey, this is supposed to be JSON. And so we can convert this into JSON using json.parse and putting in all of this raw text that we got from events.json. Then the next thing that we did is we just said, hey, events is equal to this. And it turns out that in our little example here, we also did a bunch more in order to sort all of the data that we're being provided with. But that's OK. We don't really need to do that if we don't want to. And so we could just run our program like this. Next, we're going to call getEvents for the first time because we want to actually pull all of our information into our events variable. The next thing that we do that's probably a little bit cryptic is we say, hey, file system, I want you to watch this file. And all that watching a file means is you're looking at it for it to make changes. Every time that file changes, every time that this file changes, events.json, what's going to happen is we're going to call our getEvents function. And all that's going to do is it's going to update our events variable to be all of the new information, right? And then we're going to say, hey, I'm going to define this new route, and it's going to be a get request, which just means we're going to give information back. And then I'm going to say, hey, whenever they go to /events, I'm going to define a new function, and I'm going to give in the context. And so before we wrote out the word context, sometimes you'll see this short form CTX. But notice if I change this to context, it's the exact same. And then we change our body to be equal to the events, which are all of the events that we pulled from our file. And so if we save this, and I'll even return it back to the sorted version, if we save this, we should see, if we run this and head over into, I think it's Club 2, if we now run node index.js, we should hopefully see, maybe I didn't npm install, one sec here. We should see that whenever we call this API, it's going to return our events whenever we go to /events. And so now hopefully if I run node index.js and head over to our file, I changed the ending to be 1235, we should get nothing if we go to /hi or even if we just go to the main page. But hopefully if we go to /events, we're going to get all of that JSON that we got previously. And this may seem a bit dumb because we just got back the exact same information that we got back last time. Why are we doing this, right? But if we head into our events.json, and if we maybe deleted the first one, and maybe even deleted the last two from our events file here, we can see that if we save this, and then if we refresh our API after a few seconds, it should update to the contents of events.json. And you'll see it only has the first one in there now. And so our API is responding back with whatever is in this file. And if someone went in and edited this file and added more or removed some, our API would update and start returning that information. And so our file and our API are linked. And the way that that happened was through this watch file function. From here, we've added sort of an array for the events. We did our built-in function. We have a backend that actually returns some information. And so the next thing that we're probably going to want to do is have some way to actually use all of this information that we're getting. And so let's have a look at a very basic front end in order to display all of our events, right? So if we head into Club 3 here, we'll see that we've defined a little front end. And so if I run npm start like we did in the previous lessons, we should see in a second here that our React application opens up. And we should see that, hey, look, it looks pretty similar, hopefully, to the final solution that we're supposed to end up with. Except unfortunately, we don't have any events, so it's just giving us this little message. But if I head back into our project here, and if I head into the source, of course, and if I head into the correct page, which is the upcoming events page, you'll see all of the information that defines our upcoming events page, right? And you'll notice that we have some events, and right now the events are set to this empty sort of square brackets, which means it's empty, and our program sees that, and so it's just returning us back this message that there are no events. We could instead grab all of our events from here and maybe say, hey, events will be equal to this, and hopefully now when we save this and restart, we should see that our page gets updated with all of our events. And unfortunately, it's not going to work instantly because I think some of these values are actually missing from the list. So I think the name and the ID get messed up in the list. So if we check out if we check out this example real quick, I think I have it all right here. There we go. So if we grab all of our events, we should see that once we change our file over to just use this constant, it'll actually update our site and use all of these constant values. So if we paste all this in and uncomment, hopefully, there we go. So our site now updates, and we see all of our events that we're supposed to see, right? It looks a bit weird now because I've sort of set it off to half the screen, but this is exactly what we want. This is our end goal. But it turns out, unfortunately, we're still just using some JSON that's defined on our React project, right? We're not using our backend that we created at all. Yes?
Why does it look nice like that?
What do you mean? That's because we defined like a React front end in order to display all of this data. So if we check in this function here, just like how our previous React functions, we're defining it, and then we're saying, hey, we want this div with some classes. And long story short, we use this component called upcoming event card. And if we look at that definition, we use a bunch of HTML and CSS in order to display this in a nice way. And all of that's defined within CSS, of course. And you can download all of the starter code and grab all of our styling if you want. And so for now, we've noticed, hey, look, we have this sort of upcoming events page, and we're still just grabbing our information directly from our React project, right? We need some way to actually combine our React project and our backend together so that hopefully our API response is what fills in this information instead of manually doing it, right? We'd have to go into our file and manually change our events if we want them to update. And so now that we've shown you a front end that's hopefully worthy of the work that we've done on the back end, what we can do is we can combine our server and our back-end server and our React front end together. And so if we head into sort of Club 4, we've started to do that. And we haven't actually done any of the code to combine it together, but all we've done is we've grabbed our we've grabbed our QWEB backend and we've put it into a folder called server. And so this is all the same code, right? It's grabbing the events, it's sorting them, it's watching the file, and it's getting all of this information. And then we've also have our React project in here, right? If we go into the source folder, we have our upcoming events right here. And you'll notice that right now, we're actually using sort of all of these pre-calculated events, right? So if we head into Club 4, right, and then if we npm start, this is the exact same as Club 3, right? We're using the pre-made events, but it turns out that there's a way that we can connect these two together. And the first thing that we need to learn when we want to connect these two together is that we unfortunately have to use CORS, which stands for cross-origin resource sharing. But long story short, all that this means is your website, by default, can only get information from itself, for lack of a better word. It can only get information directly from that React server. And so if we want to use a backend that's defined elsewhere, or if we want to use a backend that's from another place, right? Notice how this React server is running on port 3000. If we want to get information from port 1000, we have to say, hey, this is okay. You're allowed to get information from here. And this is generally a security precaution done by your web browser to make sure that a website isn't just grabbing information from everywhere whenever you load it. And so we have to make a slight change to our backend in order to allow our front end to actually pull information from it. And so if we head over back into our server folder, and then if we head into index.js, it turns out that there's a library defined in order to use cores directly. And so we can first head into our server folder. If I just add a new terminal here, and then if we head into club 4 and then head into the server directory, we can see, hey, look, here is our entire backend defined right here. If we list it out, and now we could say, hey, I want to install this cores library, and it turns out it's called @koa-cores. And so if we install that, we can now start editing our file to abide by this security practice. And so the first thing that we have to do is, hey, I want to import this library, and in the same way that we've done the other ones, we'll say, hey, I want a constant, I'm going to call it cores, and it's going to require this new library called @koa-cores. From here, we want to actually use this in some way. And it turns out if we head down to here, at the very start, we're going to say, hey, I want app.use, and what I want to use is this cores sort of library. And it turns out that every time we call app.use, what we're really saying is we're defining some sort of function to be called every time we run our application. And it turns out that these are actually referred to as middleware if you want to get into backend even further. And what you can do is you can define a bunch of functions to run every time your API is called. Maybe one makes sure that the right user is calling, so it does some sort of authentication. And maybe another handles all of the cores, in this case, what this function is doing. And so if we then save our file, and if we run our backend using node index.js, we should see that everything is good. And it turns out that once again, I've accidentally used an address that's already in use. So if I stop my previous backend that was running, and if I run this again, we should see that everything's fine, right? We get no output into our console window, and that's okay. We didn't tell it to output anything. So now that we've set up our backend in order to be used with our front end, we'll head back over to our front end, right? We'll head over to upcoming events, and we'll say, hey, I don't want to use all of this pre-made events jargon, so I'm going to delete it straight up. And so from here, we actually need to use what's an example of another hook. And so last time we introduced this idea of useState, which was sort of this variable that updates our React site every time the value changes, right? In this case, we've defined a useState up here called data and setData. And so whenever data updates, if we have data being displayed on our site somewhere, our React website will automatically update that information. And so that's the real benefit of state. And it turns out there's another such hook called useEffect, which allows you to sort of run a function every time a variable changes. So we can first import it by doing the exact same thing as we would import useState. So we'll add useEffect into our import statement at the top here. And we can define a useEffect function by just saying, hey, useEffect. And this will take in two things. The first one is a function that we want to actually call. And so if we create that function just using an arrow function, that's all good. And then the second thing it will take in is an array. And this array will contain all of the variables that you want to watch, for lack of a better word. Just like how we watched the file events.json in our backend, it turns out that you can watch variables within your React project and see if they change. And so we're actually not going to enter anything. We don't want to watch anything. And it turns out if we don't enter anything into useEffect, it will run that thing exactly one time when we load our site. So now within our useEffect, we want to define some sort of function in order to get our data back from our backend. And so the first thing that we'll do is we'll define a function using sort of a constant, and we'll call it fetchData. And it turns out it's going to be an asynchronous function. The first type this is the first time that we've ever introduced them before. And it turns out that all that really means is it doesn't stop your program from running while it determines what its output is. If you've done some programming in Python before, maybe you've done something really dumb, like made a loop that loops up to maybe 100 million, you'll notice that your program will wait for that loop to finish before it continues down to the code below it. It turns out that if we define an asynchronous function, your program will continue to run while it determines the answer to this question. And it turns out that we usually want our websites to be asynchronous because we don't want our website to stop and load with an empty page while we're waiting for data to come back from our API. Instead, maybe we want a loading bar, or maybe we want a loading screen to display instead. And so that's why we asynchronously call our backend. And so we'll define an asynchronous function by saying async, and then we sort of define our function normally, right? We use our arrow function, which has the parentheses, the arrows, and in here we're going to say, hey, I want to get that response back from our backend, right? So we're going to define a constant called response, and now I'm going to say, hey, I want to wait for us to fetch this information. And it turns out that I told our backend to be on port, I think it was 3001, and if we use /events, we should get the events information. And so if we head back into our web browser, we can actually check that we're going to the right place. If we do localhost 3001, it's not found, but if we add /events, we should see all of our events information is here. So that's the exact URL that I just provided in here to fetch. The next thing that we're going to have to do is, once again, it's just going to give us the raw text. And so we have to turn this back into JSON if we want to work with it. And so we're going to say, hey, I want a new constant, and I'm going to call it new data. And in this case, I want to grab our response, and I want to turn it into JSON using .json. And then it turns out, once all of this is done, I want my site to actually update. And so I'm going to say, hey, I want to set the data on my site to be equal to this new data. And so it turns out now the variable data will store all of the response back from the API, and hopefully when we go to our site, it'll update. And it turns out that we forgot to do one more thing in here, right? We just defined this function called fetchData. It turns out we have to actually call fetchData. And so now, hopefully, when we go to our front end, we should see that nothing actually changes. And it's not very happy with us because events isn't defined, and that's because we set the default value of our useState to be events. And so if we change this just to be null for now, we should see that our site loads up and everything is fine. And you may think, hey, look, why did we do all that? Nothing actually changed. Here's our 4 events here. But it turns out if we head into our events.json file and change the value of one of these, maybe we change this from Leggett Hall to maybe Brandt Hall. I don't even know if it's Brandt Hall, maybe it's just Brandt. And if we save this, and if we refresh our page, we should see after a few seconds, it will update. And that's because first, our API needs to say, hey, look, events.json changed. Then it needs to load in all of the new values. And then now, when we reload our site, it gets back that new information from the API. If we check our API here, you'll notice that the first value changes to be the new Brandt Hall viewing. And so now, if we actually open up our developer console window here on our site, you'll notice that we're actually going to go to the network tab, and you'll notice when we refresh the page, we get a bunch of information back here. And most of this is all of the icons on our site and all of the text, but it turns out we actually are getting back our events. And if we click on events right here, you'll see, look, in our response, we have all of the event information that's being displayed on our site. And if we head back over to our React application, you'll notice that, hey, look, nowhere in our front end are we explicitly defining what the value of events are. We're just pulling it from the back end, and that back end could give us back anything. And so we can now dynamically define these events. If a user went into events.json, they could change any one of these values. They could add a new event if they so chose, or they could delete one. And that website would automatically update with all of your changes. And it maybe eventually you add some sort of form on your site or some sort of developer mode that allows you to maybe fill out a form to add a new event. And then when you fill out that form, that events.json file will change and add that new event to the bottom. And now, whenever you return back your site, it will update with the new event that you added. If you want to go even further, you could, hey, even pull this information from maybe a Google Calendar or something similar and have it automatically populate in that way. For now, we're going to clean up our site just a little bit more here. And it turns out that if we head back over to upcoming events, we were a bit lazy in the programming of this. And we just said, hey, look, I'm going to go to this upcoming event card, which if we actually press F12 to get to the definition of, a little shortcut in VS Code, we'll see, hey, look, this is really just a React component, which we've seen previously, which takes in some props. And it turns out that we've called it the sort of variable info. So props.info will get at that individual component's information. And so props.info.name will get at the name, and props.info.description will get at the description. And once again, we've used a bunch of HTML and CSS to define all this. But the point that I'm trying to make is that on our upcoming events page, we're just calling these manually. The first, looks like 4 pieces of information that are provided back. If I head over to my events.json, and if I add an additional event, right, maybe I add an exact copy of this Valentine's Day event. If I add that to the bottom, and maybe I just change the title to, I don't know, maybe Happy Holidays or something, just so that it's different. If we head back over to our website and if we refresh, we'll notice that nothing shows up, nothing new changed. And if we actually go into our console by doing into our network tab and go to network and refresh our page, you'll notice that this last value is actually provided. This Happy Holidays value is given to our site, but our site isn't rendering it. And of course, we could go back over to our site and we could say, hey, look, I want to render an additional one. So I'll create a new upcoming event card, and I'll say, hey, I want to grab the fourth one in our sort of array of events. And now if I go back to my site and if I refresh it, hopefully our Happy Holidays one shows up. This may seem like a poor solution, because what happens now if we go to the events page and, hey, look, this Brant Visiting Hall sort of event already happened. If I then save my file and if I then refresh, our website errors out. It provides a completely blank page, and that's because we didn't provide it with enough data. The React site doesn't know what to do if these values in here are undefined. And it turns out our data array only has 4 values in it instead of 5. And so we need some way to dynamically show the amount of events that we have. We want our website to be truly dynamic. We want whatever the backend provides to be displayed on the front end, hopefully without creating an error like this. And it turns out that data is really just a JavaScript array. And so if we were to maybe take this array and iterate over it, we could only display the values that are actually within it. And so your first thought may be, hey, look, I want to iterate over an array. Let's use a for loop, right? But it turns out that JavaScript actually provides a very useful function called map, and it will actually iterate over it for you and call a function every time you iterate over it. And so just like how you would say for I in an array in Python, we can instead maybe define some JavaScript within our return statement. So we're going to use curly braces, and then we'll say, hey, data.map, I want to map, which just means I want to go over every single value. And then the first thing that we have to do is give each value some sort of name. And so I'm just going to call this one event. And then the next thing, you first have to define a function within your map statement that's going to be called on every value of your array. And so the first thing that you have to do is give your parameter a name, right? And so each individual event, we'll just call it event. And then, of course, we create our arrow, and we create our inner function. And so what this does is it iterates over every value of our data, and then it says, hey, the first value will be equal to event, and then once we're done with it, it'll set the second value equal to event. You can see this a bit easier if we just console.log out event, and if we save, hopefully if we head into our console, we should see that all of our event objects are individually printed out, right? So first event is equal to this, second event is equal to this, and so on. From there, we want to, in some way, create one of these upcoming event components automatically. And so what we can say is, hey, look, I want my function to return something. Just like how we had our components return things, within this map statement, we can have it actually return something. And we can say, hey, look, I want to return maybe an upcoming event card. And maybe in this case, I want the info to be, instead of being data of 1 or data of 2 or data of 3, I want it to be this event. And so we'll just say, hey, event. And then I want to use backslash because we don't want to put anything within this. And then I'll close that up. And hopefully now, if we save our file, we should see that our website updates and it automatically adds the events that are within it. But most importantly, if we go back over to events.json and if we delete one of the events and if we save it, and then if we refresh once our API updates, hey, look, that missing event is now gone. We only have 3 events, and we didn't have to change our React sort of code. And so it turns out that this entire map statement, all that this is really doing is defining 3 of these upcoming event cards in this case. So it would be like going upcoming event card, info equals data of 0. And then it's just doing this 3 more times for each of the events that are in it, changing the index each time from 1 to 2. And so we're really creating 3 of these stacked on top of each other, as you can see on our site. But map provides us a way to dynamically do it. We're dynamically looping over the data that we've gotten from our backend. We're defining a component for each set of that data, and then we're displaying it on our site. And so it turns out that we've now created a fully dynamic application, right? We're getting all of our information from our backend API, which we defined using this new Koa library. and then we connected it to our front end. And so whenever we load our site, the upcoming events are equal to this events.json file. And later on, we'll show you a better way to edit this file, but it turns out maybe a non-technical person could come in here and they could say, hey, look, I want to create new events, and they could pretty easily define all of the things needed for this event. They could say your ID and the name and all of that stuff, and they can add a new event to the site without editing any of the actual React code or editing any of the actual backend code. And that way, we can host our server somewhere, or host our site somewhere, and we can just have it load up these events every single time we open it up. And so today, we introduced you to the idea of what a backend actually is. And we created one to display all of our events. And so we then incrementally updated our backend in order to add some security features using cores in order to be able to call it on our React front end. And then we created a front end using some pre-written code to be able to display all of this stuff nice and prettily, which we've provided to you on our GitHub page. But it turns out that you may still think that this was really a big hassle in order to just display a bunch of text on our site. And I would generally agree with you, but it turns out that this idea of creating a separate front end and a separate back end is how pretty much every site on the web is run today, especially the more complicated ones where you have to log in with an account and get a different set of information back. And so maybe for this specific example, it's a little bit too simple to see the real power and reason why we use a back end and front end separately. But when it comes time to create your own club website at the end of the year, this will make it easier for you to hand your club website off to someone else and have them continue to develop on it, or even hand your club website on to someone who's non-technical, because you can define files for individual parts of your site and have your backend supply that information instead. And so at the end of the day, maybe today was a little bit too simple of an example, but the idea of splitting out your website into a backend and a front end will serve you very well as you continue on your web development journey. Thank you for coming.